Kia ora Aotearoa, good evening and welcome to the Union Report, where we review the news week through the lens of industrial disputes with union leaders, commentators and politicians. Joining me tonight to review the week is the President of the Council of Trade Unions, Helen, and Garry Parsloe, President of the Maritime Union of New Zealand. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, issue 1, when public-private partnerships go bad, does Serco's private prison failings this week suggest the state or the free market are better economic guardians? Issue 2, right-wing blogs target police staffing costs last week. Are online attacks the new negotiating tactic of choice for employers? And issue 3, Nikki Kay wants it moved and the government wants it sold to fund Mayor Len Brown's public transport agenda. What now for the ports of Auckland as an Auckland asset? Plus, we'll wrap with a final thought, but let's start the show with issue 1. It was announced last week that private prison operator Serco has failed to meet half of its performance targets since taking over Auckland's Mount Eden prison. In a time of recession, are private-public partnerships the best use of public money? Helen, 3 inmates were wrongly released, 1 escaped, 3 were wrongfully detained, and the percentage of sentenced prisoners with an appropriate plan in place within required timeframes was only 28%. Are public-private partnerships an answer, or are they part of the problem?
Well, it's interesting. For each one of those failures is some service that actually the prisons are not getting, and it's always portrayed as the number of people who escaped or didn't get a proper exit plan or whatever. But actually, what is happening here is opportunities for rehabilitation, and probably for some of the most basic treatment in prison are being denied these people by an underperforming manager of the prisons. There's a fundamental thing about prisons. If you're going to imprison people, you've got a responsibility, in my view, to run the prisons. And what was interesting was Anne Tolley's response. Mrs. National Testing, actually, once the schools all national testing and league tabled and the rest. But when it came to this, her response was, failing half your performance indicators is not bad in your first year. I think she was very, very slack about a service that we are now paying for as taxpayers that we were providing perfectly well previously through state-run prison.
It's interesting, isn't it? If a public sector had produced reports like this, had failed half of the standards, there'd be an absolute riot on our hands.
That's right. Now, this prison company is making a profit. It's not only being contracted to perform what was being performed by the state perfectly well beforehand. It's making a profit, and it's able to make a profit regardless of the fact that it has lost, not met half of its performance indicators. And Garry was saying earlier he's been talking to the union that covers these workers earlier today, and that those workers in the prison are also having to cop the privatisation of that service through reductions in terms and conditions.
Garry, the first move by any private-public partnerships is an attempt to lower labour costs to produce profits. Is that the socially responsible manner in which public assets should be run?
No, of course not. And what Helen said earlier is correct. They're not meeting their target in their Serco, and therefore the state, by paying, Serco is then bleeding. Then the attack is on those workers in there who now have their wages, I understand, driven down, and they're actually putting pressure on extending the rosters, unworkable rosters, long hours, and everybody in there is suffering, especially those workers.
Have you seen those same types of pressures at the ports of Auckland?
Yes, we have the same things at the ports of Auckland. When there's any cost cutting, the cost cutting comes back to the workers, and it's similar to what's happening there. So
the first casualty is always workers' conditions and workers' wages for a profit margin. How long do you think that could work as an actual social policy?
Well, it shouldn't be working at all. I mean, they should be putting a stop to it and making sure in any workforce, the same as on the wharf, I said workers have the right to be treated respectfully. They have the right to a decent job. And you can't have a right to a decent job when these things are going on.
Helen, the Guardian newspaper last week did a report on the PPPs in Britain and found that over the 30-year life, the cost was 12 times higher than if the government had just borrowed the money and run it themselves. Is this short-term thinking that will leave us with a mountain of debt?
Yeah, well, it's ideology actually. I think the government knows that the maths don't add up, and there hasn't been PPPs anywhere that have proved to be, worth it. And they're moving into the charter school area, privatisation of our schools. They're building private built private PPPs in the school sector where the schools don't have full use of the building and
That's
the
right.
community use is restricted. And there's all sorts of failings. I just noticed in the paper over the weekend that there's some big apartment building being built here, PPP, between Housing New Zealand and a whole lot of investors.
That's right.
Building turns out to be leaky, and the investors are demanding that the council give them rate relief. So every time private investment goes wrong, people turn to the state and say, bail us out, bail us out. And yet at the same time, people who do invest in PPP seem not to be prepared to take the risk that sort of investment might offer. But the whole philosophy that the state, is not a good runner of business has been proven wrong time and time again.
Yeah.
We saw it in rail, we had to buy back the rail. We saw it in the airline, we had to buy back the airline. We saw it in the bank, we had to set up our own bank. Actually, it doesn't work, it's ideological, and every time we do it, New Zealand gets set back.
Isn't it concerning that we're no longer basing policy on empirical fact and it's now just rhetoric?
Well, I think it's always been like that, actually.
Yeah.
I think that the ideology that drives politics in this country, leading to what really is just a whole series of leaky home equivalents, failed policies through deregulation, is all over the place to see. Look, honestly, over the weekend they reported rents in Christchurch have gone up 26%.
Yeah.
Post-war rents were frozen, essential goods prices were frozen, you weren't allowed to profiteer. Now, according to Jerry Brownlee, the increase of rents by 26% will encourage the housing market in Christchurch. That's ideological, isn't it? There are people being driven out of their homes because they can't pay the rent, and the state is sitting back and letting that happen. I'll tell you what, if we ran a campaign in Christchurch to increase wages by 26%, people would say we were opportunistic, we're not valuing what was going on down there, didn't understand the plight of business, but for some reason it's okay to lift your rents like that without any control.
Garry, Bill English told New Zealand only a few months ago that the Serco would cost the taxpayer 10% less than the public sector. With these results, is saving 10%, even if we do, actually worth it?
No, it's probably not worth it. And again, as I said earlier, the only way they save this money at the end of the day is attacking those workers, attacking their wages, attacking conditions, making them work longer hours, all of those things. Where else is there their monetary savings?
Yeah. Question to both of you. If the British government haven't been able to negotiate PPPs that protect their taxpayers from vast downstream debt liabilities, how will the New Zealand Treasury do it?
Yeah, no idea.
It won't.
No idea. And it won't.
It will excuse it, like they did in the weekend. It'll say, look, they're only in their first year. I mean, actually, if you ever look at the legacy of private prisons, they will fail again next year. They will fail and they will fail and they will fail. And each year there'll be another excuse and another excuse and another excuse. And probably their prices start getting squeezed at some point, so they cut back even further and further and further. It doesn't work. The economics don't add up.
If it just seems interesting, if the British don't have the expertise within their public service to be able to negotiate these contracts, there seems to be very little hope that New Zealand would we?
Well, effectively the economics are wrong, and so you can, no matter how you might set up the system, what we know, I mean, look at ACC, such an effective and efficient system when it's run well, in terms of they can't privatise it because the insurance companies are not interested in ACC at the levy rates that we charge. Why is that? Because we're efficient as a group. It's efficient for us to provide accident cover, it's efficient for us to provide education, it's efficient for us to provide health, and it's efficient for us to provide things like prisons, police, defence, those other services.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2. The Dominion Post last week noted that police may be the next target for austerity when right-wing blog site Kiwi Blog released figures attacking the wages earned by police officers. Helen, is feeding the attack blogs the new negotiating tactics of employers when wanting to erode workers' conditions? Is that what we're seeing now?
I think it is, and Garry will say what happened down at the port there, where the port continuously leaked material to right-wing blogs. But it was interesting, isn't it? The police are really under attack, and it's in all of our interests. We all have different experiences of the police, but fundamentally all of us want a good, honest police force.
Sure.
And basically that's what we've got, And if you start screwing it down and cutting their wages and all of that, firstly you've got to undermine them publicly, which is what the blog stuff is about, because actually they're one of the most respected professions in this country. So to get away with it, you've got to undermine them. So what you do is you send some stuff off to a right-wing blog who's happy to say they're overpaid and they're underworked and all that. So remember John Key said actually the police have got lots of time on their hands.
That's right. They could investigate his complaints because they have plenty of time on their hands.
So firstly you undermine them, then you go after things like, you want performance pay. Well, can you imagine performance pay in the police force? What is it? Completion rates, prosecution rates, all of us are at risk from ill-founded pay policies in the police. And then, you know, thirdly, you really do start cutting down their numbers and cutting down their equipment and all of that. So that's very, very short term. And I think that, yes, feeding stuff to right-wing blogs, they've done it around teaching, they've done it around unions. I mean, the blog, the whale oil blog, is running constantly, I understand, stories about unions.
That's right,
quite,
that's right.
You know, misinformed stories. And they do that to discredit workers' organisations and genuine workers' claims.
If you start cutting back on police conditions and wages, don't you open the police force up to corruption? I mean, if they're not secure in their own jobs, isn't it a lot more tempting to take a little bit on the side?
Well, there's two things. One is, yes, you open them up for corruption. Secondly, you don't attract the sort of people that you might want in a police force. And, you know, their wages and conditions in this country are by no means luxurious. And they're 24/7, you know, shifts are regularly doing extra time, stressful, dangerous, and their wages don't reflect that now, let alone if you cut them any further. And of course they don't get to join a union. Well, they have an association, but they don't have the same industrial rights as other workers.
That's right.
And they don't necessarily, it's not easy for them to speak out. So, you know, we're very interested in supporting those types of workers, the workers in defence. You would have seen the story the other day, workers in defence are having all their wages cut, and they don't even have enough now to crew the ships. You know, I mean, we hardly own any defence equipment, but that we do have. We don't have enough, which is putting our fishing industry at risk. And, you know, those defence workers don't have any union, don't have any voice, and their wages, they haven't had a pay increase for 4 years, and they're now losing people, bleeding people. So actually these services we need to stand up for and stick up for as a movement, because all workers, as Garry said, should have a good go, decent job, and be looked after.
Garry, Munn's faced this exact type of online attack by right-wing bloggers during your dispute when a worker's private work history was published online. How do unions deal with this in the new age of online propaganda?
Well, in regard to the problem with the port company was giving our information of our members to the blogs and putting them out, and we've of course gone to the Privacy Commission over that. They not only put up people's information where they were doing about their, not only themselves but their families, and then they got onto the blogs too, talked about our wages and misinformation too, 96,000 for 26 hours a week.
That's right.
So they put misinformation up, information they shouldn't be up, privacy information and all that, but the ports of Auckland use that as one of their only tools. While we were sitting there negotiating with them, they're advertising our jobs all over the world, you know, to England and all over the world. They're advertising our jobs. They came back and they offered us redundancies. Then they went in and started contracting out our jobs while we were in those negotiations. So with the blogs or whatever, at the end of the day, there was never any good faith bargaining by the ports of Auckland.
Does it undermine good faith bargaining?
Of course it undermines it. I mean, and at the end of the day, how do you repair those things? You're meant to have a relationship, you're meant to bargain in good faith. When those things are going on blogs, I mean, they don't disappear, and that stays with us, and that argument stays there forever.
That's right, that's right.
My view is the tactic there was to definitely undermine the union, not the worker, but by using workers individually. Now, those workers were quite frightened by disclosure of their information, and we've talked to them. They were particularly frightened when they went back to the port. The port is now taking photos of those workers every minute that they're working. They've got cameras in the cabs, they've got cameras in the cranes, got cameras in the lunchroom. I've heard from those workers, they're saying, what are they going to do with that information?
That's right.
We don't trust them. They haven't just come open and clean about the privacy leaks. They haven't said we won't do it again, and now every minute they're being photographed down there to intimidate them. What that blog does in particular is it runs a story, and then really nasty people come behind it and make really disparaging and awful comments. And you know, my concern is that these, for us, it's part of the process, and we'll deal with it. But for these workers, there's been long-term implications for them and their families.
Absolutely. How, when fighting for public support and disputes now, how important do you think is social media?
Oh, very important. And, you know, the counter to this story is how well the Maritime Union used social media during the dispute and organised through it and put out messages through it and got a lot of support, brilliant YouTube clip and people stepping up to run Facebook pages and all the rest. Nothing replaces good organisation of workers and a strong cause, and they had a brilliant cause, strong cause. They were really under the pump. But social media was very important to connecting up with new communities and getting the message out.
Does the CTU have any future plans specifically to focus on social media as a forum?
Well, we use it whenever we can.
Right.
And we don't know the full strength of it yet. You keep seeing examples of it. Everybody's learning
Yeah.
what the potential is of it. What we did find out with the Maritime Union, for example, is a lot of their members use it.
Right.
What we found out with AFCO is a lot of the members don't use it. So
Right.
there is an internet divide in this
Sure.
country, access, you know. So we have to be flexible and use a variety of approaches.
Gary, I want to touch on something that you brought up earlier. Do you think these types of online attacks damage the relationship between negotiators? I mean, once upon a time, you might have had an angry comment from a union delegate or a boss in the newspaper, and that would have been the extent of it. Now you've got a very, very vicious campaigns that go online that seem to be fed from the employers. Does that new part of this new part of this, does that make it much more bitter?
It makes it better, and it probably keeps it a bit better because the stuff they're putting on blogs is very personal and it shouldn't be going there. And they have, in this particular dispute, we've had attacks on our families, not only in the family values. Not only do they fight with the union and fight with the members of the union, but they send information to their homes that the wife opens up saying they'll all be sacked, there's no jobs and all that. They've actually taken a reprehensible campaign against us and attacked the families and the family values. And now, as Helen pointed out, every crane on the waterfront has surveillance in it. It doesn't matter if you go into the mess room, it doesn't matter if you go into crane or shuttle or anywhere. And when they're giving your information out to blogs, then they're taking you under, everything you do is on camera, every single thing you do. I mean, how do you live with that? How do you have a relationship with your employer going forward? It is very difficult and very hard.
One of the claims the port has put up, and I don't know where it's at the moment, is the right to search everybody whenever they want to, search their bag, search their,
Well, the police don't have that power. Why should a company?
I know, and customs do if there's issues around drugs or whatever on the port. But what sort of employer puts in a claim to be able to just search you anytime, any place? And that's a random drug testing, searching, surveillance. It's this sort of thing of, and what it is part of the port's campaign that all those workers down there are thugs and bullies, and they try to run up this sort of campaign. But all in all, we take it on the chin. These workers take it very personally and get very, very upset about it, especially the young ones. They're quite shocked to be treated that way.
Question to both of you finally on this. What is the long-term impact of running down public services if the criticism is merely a negotiating tactic?
Well, it undermines the government's own service. So the criticism of the police, for example, that they need to run up to be able to attack the police because everybody loves the police and that the government's not going to get away with it without tainting their reputation, is in the end negative for New Zealand. Why would you run down your own police force? Why would you undermine it?
Running down the ports of Auckland seems to be fairly counterproductive when we all own it.
Yes, it's counterproductive. And the port is a good port, it's a vibrant port, it's productive, it turned over 6%. It's the heart and the soul, the pulse of the city. And without it, we wouldn't have that. And they attack it, and you get that back when vessels start moving to other ports and shipping companies go to other ports because they're always attacking their own port and running it. It's silly. It's a nonsense.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3. Nikki Kay wants it moved and the government wants it sold to fund Mayor Len Brown's public transport agenda. What now for the ports of Auckland as an Auckland asset? Garry, times are tough and Auckland needs to fund its transport infrastructure somehow. Why shouldn't Auckland sell the ports?
Well, they shouldn't be selling the port. The port is the heart and soul of the city, as I said. It's producing well, and if you don't have a port in your city, then you don't have factories and you don't have manufacturing because they shift to where the port is. Every manufacturer needs a port nearby to import and export. So if you haven't got a port that's there that's working, or you haven't got a port, then they move there. I mean, it's simply to take a look at Sydney. Sydney shifted their port, or closed up the port to beautify it. They put parks and they put apartments there, and everything moved down to Kembla and Newcastle. So it goes down to Kembla, Newcastle, the manufacturing goes down there, the factories go down there, massive unemployment in Sydney, which would create in Auckland. And then again, you've got to get the goods back into Auckland. So you've got congestion on the roads, you've got all the traffic, you've got everything, and it's just a madness. And they're thinking of going back to start opening up more of Port Botany and.
So they're going backwards.
Well, they're thinking of bringing it back into Sydney. I mean, there's a place in a port. You should have parks, you should have apartments, but you also should have a productive port because the manufacturing and the businesses need that to export and import. And if you don't, as I said earlier, and you move out, well then they move out with you, as what's happened in Sydney, and then you've got to bring it all, the greenhouse effect, and all of those things happening, and the value and the profit you take out of your city is an absolute madness as well.
Helen, the government justifies selling our electricity assets because it will provide 400 million for South Island dairy farming irrigation plans. Is it a false dichotomy, though, to justify the sale of one asset for the investment into another?
Well, I think it's interesting to justify the sale of the port, if anybody's trying to do that, to build a integrated transport infrastructure. Because ships, we're an island, don't know if you've noticed, but and so we need ships to come in and out of this country to drop things off and pick things up. And so if you're going to have an integrated transport strategy, you have to have a port. And as Garry said, you know, the best place for it is in a city where the goods are being made. And time is of an essence to retailers and manufacturers, and any delay in transportation or extra costs, you know, kills them. So there is no justification. It is also a profitable port. It is also one of the most valuable and beautiful pieces of Auckland. And when you sell it, even if you lease out the land to a user, then you lose control of things like the environmental protection of that base, of things like using it for parks, because every time you want to then increase the public space, you're fighting with a private right, the property right that somebody else has been given. So it's absolutely crazy to even consider, you know, the privatisation of that port.
Well, Garry, what if we did go ahead and moved it to Marsden Point or Tauranga? Those are the two suggestions at the moment. Do you think there'd be any positives in moving that?
No, none at all, because the population is here, and whatever you're manufacturing, whatever you're importing has to come back here.
Right.
And even when the stoppages and lockouts were happening on the waterfront and the ships were going down to Tauranga, they just couldn't get them back there. Tauranga's overloaded. I mean, as we go forward, you'll need the three main ports going for the population, the growth and all that. You'll need Tauranga, you'll need Auckland, and you'll need North ports.
Right.
And you mainly need Auckland, because this is where we live, this is where the people are, this is where the population is, and this is where the growth is. And if you start moving away from that, you have all the problems that I just alluded to earlier on.
What are the solutions moving forward then?
Well, you need the balance, as I said earlier. You need the balance of parks and coffee bars and all that, and you need a nice area for that, and most cities have that. And then you need the productive end, and that's got to be productive, and that's got to be returning that value back into Auckland City, back into the people of Auckland.
Do you agree with the ideas to expand the port into the harbour?
No, on balance, if it needs it, look at it. But I think they've taken on more. They're talking about the problems they've got. They can't make a profit. They can't do this and that. All the misleading information, and now they're talking about expanding it. No, I think on balance they need to have a port, not in the heart of it, moving away. But what they are talking about, and I've seen the plans of, is just a bit over the top, I think.
Yeah. Do you accept that there's a slight annoyance from Aucklanders when they look at all of that space on their waterfront and it's just used cars being parked there?
Yeah, that's down in the middle wharves.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, the cars have got to get parked somewhere, I suppose, but there wouldn't be a problem in moving them further down. There's no problem in that. I mean, they are beautifying up the wharves as they go along, and that's good too. But the one they've got on the plan now of taking the port across into the Devonport side, I don't support that at all.
Right. Helen, if government won't allow councils to borrow for infrastructure and ratepayers will revolt if rates are raised too high, what other options are there other than selling assets?
Well, I mean, I think the options are to get governments that have a more balanced economic view about what the value is of owning things, assets, like, you know, including the power companies, but also local government assets. And do understand that borrowing for investment is not a negative way of managing your accounts. I mean, we all borrow to invest. It's when you borrow for, you know, for a meal or whatever, when you put that on the credit card, that it's not so smart.
Sure.
But you know, this port has been servicing the city for a good long time, and actually, I think people aren't complaining about it. What's going on here is a campaign generating uncertainty around the future ownership, the future running. As Garry said, the undermining of people's confidence in this port, and it's all aimed at a number of things: maximising the profit from the port, undermining the working conditions and the union, and also moving towards privatisation of the port. And don't you think if they move this port out of Auckland, it'll be into a private owner? They won't be moving it out of the port for the council to continue running it. It'll be an effort to privatise it, and one of the reasons will be, well, we're moving it, we're going to free up the land. And actually there's plenty of land on the waterfront to share, and these workers have got really good ideas about how to share the land and how they think it could be better run, of how to make it more practical and more efficient. The port hasn't changed a bit in terms of its attitude to these workers, and we're having workers dismissed, we're having workers bullied, we're having all sorts of carrying on still going down on that port. The facilitation's going along, but whether it will actually resolve this dispute or not is doubtful. If I was at port, I'd get back in that room, find answers, accept what the unions put on the table, which are very, very significant changes, and move ahead and try and work with this workforce to build the best port in the country.
Are those tactics acceptable for what is effectively a public asset?
No, they're not acceptable anywhere actually, but they're particularly not acceptable given what this port has already done to this workforce and what they've cost the people of Auckland in the way that they've played up, in the way that in my view they've breached the law by breaching good faith, in the way that they had this place stocked for all of those weeks and the money they spent on advertising. In my view there has to be some accountability for what's happened down at that port, and the first step should be for them to settle the collective agreement on the terms that the union is putting on the table, which are significant, which the public have seen, which have provided balance between employment security, having every third weekend off, those sorts of things, but also will change the rostering and improve productivity on the port, which is already good, and get on with building this port and stop all this talk, which is actually undermining it. I mean, ships are telling the union we're not coming in, we're not coming back until it's settled. We don't want to give up our places at Tauranga or Napier or whatever unless we know Auckland's full steam ahead.
Final question of both of you. Will Ports of Auckland stay as an Auckland asset? Your thoughts?
Yeah, it has to stay as an Auckland asset. It's a madness. You sell it, it's gone, you never get it back again. It returns well. It's turning 6% back to the people of Auckland, and yes, we must hold on to it.
Will we stay? Will it stay?
Well, there'll be a hell of a fight if they try to move it on, and if they really want to build a good port, then there's got to be some serious questions about the management, in my view.
Thank you, panel. Let's wrap the show with a final word. Garry, your final word this week is?
Well, my final word has got to come back to the Ports of Auckland. I just hope we can get a bit of a culture change in the management down there, because they've got this mad idea. They started off with this mad idea of that the port had to return 12%. Was not a port in the world returning 12%. I mean, we've got a good port, it's productive, and it's returning 6%, and that should be sufficient. We're in the facilitation. It would what we need to do is get the Ports of Auckland to come to that facilitation and get an agreement with us, get a reasonable, sensible agreement, and let's get on with the business of having a productive port.
Should management of the Ports of Auckland be an election issue for the mayoralty race next year?
Yeah, they should be.
Your final word?
Yeah, I want to talk about something quite different actually. I want to talk about what the government's doing around unemployment, and it's an issue that's more and more coming into our office. Really, the stuff that's going on around beneficiaries and people who are seeking work basically is a national disgrace. It's a national story, and the way the government is avoiding actually dealing with the issue about how we're going to get people into work in this country and how we're going to give particularly our young people a future, the future that they deserve, the way they're dealing with that is by covering it up, by attacking those people that don't have work. Now last weekend we had 150 people lose their jobs in manufacturing in this country. We saw it in the carpets and in an engineering company. On the same weekend as the government said it was going to introduce measures to cut people's benefits, the sort of drug testing and all of the other things that they're bringing in. Really, New Zealanders have got to start sticking up for people like that, those 150 that lost their jobs last weekend, and acknowledge it's not their fault. The hard-working people work there 25, 30 years. It's a failure of our economy. It's a failure of economic management. We're not going to let those people bear the brunt of it, become suddenly you're a worker, the next thing you're a bludger. We're not going to buy into that narrative. We are going to stick up for people who are unemployed in this country. They could be our kids, they could be your kids, they could be our neighbours' kids. And we're going to demand that people have the right to work, to decent jobs, to work, to have a sufficient benefit, to have a decent life if they are on a benefit and unable to work. And we're not going to get into the same culture that this government generates about beneficiaries. It's in all of our interests, and the divide that's being created is deliberate. It's an ideological divide, and we're all fools if we fall into it, in my view.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Garry. That's it for this show. Check out our Facebook site for ongoing union campaigns and actions, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter account for all the latest show updates. Thank you for watching Aotearoa. Join us again 8 p.m. next Monday for the Union Report here on Triangle TV, the home of original public broadcasting. Good night, New Zealand.